In the summer of 1877, a 12-year-old boy was hanged in Deadwood, South Dakota, becoming the youngest person ever executed in the Dakota Territory. His crime? The methodical murder of at least 5 children, carried out with surgical precision in the back room of a butcher shop on Main Street. What made this case truly disturbing wasn't just the age of the killer, but the complete absence of remorse, the clinical curiosity with which he selected his victims, and the chilling confession that revealed a mind utterly devoid of human empathy. The boy had been killing since he was 10 years old, learning anatomy through murder, perfecting his technique with each victim. Before we continue with the story of Thomas Canfield and the horror he brought to America's most lawless town, Before we continue with the story of what became known as the Deadwood child murders, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and nightmare, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And we'd love to know, what state are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now let's step back to where this horror truly began, in the mud-soaked streets of the most dangerous town in the American West. The Deadwood of 1876 was less a town than a wound carved into the Black Hills, bleeding gold and attracting every variety of desperado, dreamer, and damned soul the frontier could produce. Crammed into a narrow gulch where pine-covered slopes pressed close on either sides, the settlement sprawled in defiance of geography and common sense, a maze of canvas tents, hastily built wooden structures, and mud streets that turned to rivers whenever rain fell. The population swelled from nothing to nearly 5,000 souls in mere months, though souls might be too generous a term for many who found their way there. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had violated the Fort Laramie Treaty, bringing prospectors onto Lakota land in waves that no treaty or moral consideration could stem. By the time the government reluctantly opened the territory, Deadwood had already established itself as a place where law meant little and survival meant everything. Murder was commonplace enough that the town's first cemetery, Mount Moriah, filled rapidly with wooden markers bearing little more than nicknames or question marks where names should be. Main Street stretched through the gulch like a crooked spine, lined with establishments that catered to every vice. Saloons outnumbered legitimate businesses 3 to 1, gambling dens operated around the clock, and the red light district made no pretense of discretion. The Gem Theatre, despite its cultured name, was among the most notorious, a combination saloon, brothel, and gambling hall where fortunes changed hands and lives ended with shocking regularity. Wild Bill Hickok himself would be shot dead at a poker table in the No. 10 saloon that August, his murder becoming just another story in a town built on violence. But for all its chaos and carnage, Deadwood possessed a strange kind of order, the unspoken rules of a frontier society, where a man's word was his bond, and thieves faced swift, brutal justice from miners' courts. Children, however, occupied a peculiar space in this moral framework. Hundreds of them lived in Deadwood, some with families, many more orphaned by disease, accident, or abandonment. They worked in the mines, the mills, the brothels, performing whatever labor their small bodies could manage. A missing child might prompt concern, but in a place where death was commonplace and people vanished into the wilderness or moved on without warning, sustained investigation was rare. It was into this world that young Thomas Canfield arrived in late March 1876, traveling in the wagon of a freight hauler who had found the boy wandering alone on the trail from Cheyenne. The boy claimed his father, a prospector named Jonathan Canfield, had died when their mineshaft collapsed 3 days prior. The freight hauler, a practical man named Silas Vaughan, had neither the time nor the inclination to verify the story. Deadwood was full of orphans, one more would scarcely be noticed. Thomas appeared unremarkable at first glance. 10 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that hung in his eyes and a thin, angular face that seemed too old for his years. His clothes were the rough homespun, typical of prospectors' families, worn but serviceable. He spoke little, answering questions with brief, precise responses that suggested intelligence beyond his years. His eyes, a peculiar pale grey, had a quality that some found unsettling, a stillness that seemed to look through rather than at whatever they fixed upon. Vaughn deposited the boy at the Deadwood Merchants Association building, a recent addition to the town intended to bring some semblance of civic organization to the chaos. The woman who ran the informal orphan placement service, a severe widow named Constance Pritchard, took one look at Thomas and sighed with the weariness of someone who had processed too many displaced children in too short a time. She added his name to her ledger in handwriting that grew increasingly cramped as the pages filled with names. "Can you work?" she asked, her tone making clear that the only acceptable answer was yes. "I can work," Thomas replied, his voice flat and uninflected. "Any trade skills? Your father teach you anything useful?" "He taught me how things come apart," Thomas said, a strange phrasing that Constance attributed to the boy's grief and shock. "How they fit together inside." She nodded absently, already considering the options. The mines always needed workers, but the boy seemed too small, too frail for that brutal labor. The mills were scarcely better. Then she remembered that Garrett Hollis, who ran the butcher shop on Main Street, had mentioned needing help. His previous assistant had been crushed between two ore wagons the week prior, one of those casual tragedies that Deadwood absorbed without pause. Garrett Hollis was a man of substantial physical presence, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from decades of hefting beef carcasses and wielding cleavers. He had come to Deadwood from Kansas City, drawn not by gold, but by the certainty that thousands of miners would need feeding. His shop occupied a sturdy building halfway down Main Street, built of proper lumber rather than canvas or pine scraps, with a cold room dug deep into the hillside behind where meat could be kept in the cool darkness. When Constance brought Thomas to meet Hollis, the butcher was elbow-deep in the carcass of a pig, separating ribs with practiced efficiency. He looked up at the thin boy with mild interest, noted the steady way the child watched his hands work, and shrugged his acceptance. "Boy's got to earn his keep," Hollis said. "Room in the back, meals twice daily, and $2 a week once he's learned the work. If he can't stomach the blood, he's gone." Thomas stepped closer to the work table, his pale eyes fixed on where Hollis's knife had exposed the architecture of bone and muscle beneath the pig's skin. "I can stomach it," he said quietly. Something in his tone made Hollis glance at him sharply, but the boy's expression remained neutral, almost serene. That night, Thomas slept on a cot in the storage room behind the shop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and old blood, the sounds of Deadwood's nightlife filtering through the walls. In the darkness, his eyes remained open for a long time, staring at nothing, his breathing slow and even as asleep as though he was wide awake. His mind turned over the day's observations with the methodical precision of someone cataloguing specimens, the way Hollis's knife had parted flesh from bone, the different resistances of muscle and tendon, the careful preservation of certain organs while others were discarded as waste. He had told the truth when he said his father taught him how things came apart. Jonathan Canfield had been a cruel drunk who beat his son with systematic regularity, and Thomas had studied each injury with detached curiosity, noting which blows left lasting marks and which faded quickly, which caused sharp pain and which dull aches. When the mine shaft collapsed, it had done so with Thomas's careful assistance. A few critical support beams weakened over several nights until the inevitable happened. His father's screams had been educational, teaching Thomas about the different sounds pain could produce. Now, surrounded by the tools of Hollis's trade, Thomas felt something that might have been anticipation in another child, though in him it registered as simple recognition of opportunity. Deadwood was a place where things came apart constantly, where the line between life and death was thinner than anywhere he had known. And here, in this shop filled with sharp instruments and dark corners, he would have the chance to learn so much more. The education of Thomas Canfield began in earnest the next morning, when Garrett Hollis showed him how to process a deer carcass that a hunter had brought in before dawn. The butcher worked with the efficiency of long practice, his knife moving in sure strokes that spoke to an intimate knowledge of anatomy. "Most folks just hack away," Hollis explained, not looking up from his work. "But if you understand how an animal is put together, you can take it apart clean, waste nothing. See here, this connective tissue. You cut along it, not through it. Follows the natural lines." Thomas watched with absolute focus, his pale eyes tracking every movement of the blade. He asked no questions, but his attention was so complete that Hollis found it almost unnerving. Most boys fidgeted, looked away from the gore, needed time to adjust to the reality of butchering. This child stood motionless except for the slight tilt of his head as he studied each revelation of the knife. Muscle fibers run in directions. Hollis continued, warming to his subject. You cut against the grain for tender meat, with it for tougher cuts that need long cooking. And the organs, each one has its place, its purpose. Heart here, lungs there, liver tucked up under the ribs. Same design in every creature, just different sizes. Even in people? Thomas asked, his tone merely curious. Hollis paused, his knife hovering over the carcass. I suppose so, he said slowly, though that's not knowledge I've had occasion to use. Something in the boy's question unsettled him, though he could not articulate why. He pushed the feeling aside and returned to his demonstration. Over the following weeks, Thomas proved an exceptionally quick study. His small hands soon learned to wield the knives with surprising precision, and he showed no squeamishness about any aspect of the work. If anything, he seemed to gravitate toward the more complex tasks, the ones that required careful dissection and an understanding of internal structures. Hollis found himself giving the boy increasingly sophisticated work, impressed despite himself. But there were moments that gave the butcher pause. The way Thomas would sometimes stand over a carcass long after the work was done, studying it with that peculiar intensity. The questions he asked, always phrased neutrally but carrying implications that made Hollis uncomfortable. How long did different organs take to stop functioning? What happened when major blood vessels were severed? Could you tell from examining remains how long ago death had occurred? Morbid curiosity, Hollis told himself, attributing it to the boy's recent loss. The child had watched his father die, after all. Such experiences marked a young mind. What Hollis did not know was that his shop had a secret visitor in the darkest hours of night. Deadwood's underworld included men who killed for money, for insult, or for pleasure, and occasionally these men needed to dispose of evidence. Garrett Hollis, whatever his public morality, was known among certain circles as someone who would accept a wrapped bundle in the dead of night, ask no questions, and ensure that what went into his cold room emerged as unidentifiable scraps that could be scattered or buried without suspicion. Thomas discovered this trade by accident one night in late April when voices outside the shop woke him. Through a gap in the storage room wall, he watched as Hollis accepted a canvas-wrapped burden from two men whose faces were hidden by hat brims. Money changed hands, and after the men left, Hollis carried the bundle to the cold room. The butcher's face, illuminated briefly by lamplight, showed neither disgust nor pleasure, merely the resigned acceptance of a man conducting a business transaction. The next morning, Hollis seemed more tense than usual, and he sent Thomas on a series of errands that kept the boy away from the shop until afternoon. When Thomas returned, he noticed that certain tools had been cleaned with unusual thoroughness, and the cold room had been locked, something Hollis rarely bothered with during business hours. Thomas said nothing, filed the observation away, and continued his work. But that night, when the shop was closed and Hollis had gone to the Gem Theater for his evening whiskey, Thomas picked the cold room lock with a piece of bent wire, a skill learned from watching the town's less reputable residents work. Inside, among the hanging sides of beef and pork, he found what remained of the previous night's delivery. Hollis had already begun the process of reduction, and what Thomas saw confirmed his suspicions. The proportions were wrong for any animal he had seen, the bone structure too familiar. He studied the partial remains with clinical interest, noting the cut marks, the methodical way Hollis had approached the task, the efficiency of the work. This discovery did not horrify Thomas. Instead, it illuminated possibilities he had been considering in abstract terms. If Hollis could dispose of human remains this way, processing them into anonymity, then the method itself was proven. The butcher had demonstrated that in Deadwood's chaos, a body could simply cease to exist, transformed into scraps that drew no attention. The next day, Thomas worked beside Hollis with renewed focus, absorbing every detail of the butcher's technique. He noted where Hollis made his primary cuts, which tools worked best for different tissues, how to work quickly without leaving obvious marks. Hollis, pleased by what he interpreted as the boy's growing dedication to the trade, began to trust him with more complex work. "You've got a natural talent for this," Hollis remarked one afternoon as Thomas efficiently broke down a lamb carcass. "Steady hands, good eye for the anatomy. You could make a real living at this trade." Thomas nodded, without looking up from his work, his knife moving with practiced precision along a line of fascia. "I want to understand how everything works," he said, "how it all fits together." "Well, you're learning that sure enough," Hollis replied, missing the broader implication of the boy's words. By early June, Thomas had achieved a level of skill that would have been remarkable in an apprentice twice his age. More importantly, he had gained Hollis's trust and a deep understanding of the shop's rhythms, its blind spots, the times when he could work undisturbed. He had access to professional tools, a soundproof cold room, and the knowledge that at least some irregular activities in the shop would go unreported by his employer. All he lacked was a subject for his studies, but Deadwood would provide that soon enough. The town was full of children whose absence would scarcely be noted, whose deaths could be attributed to any number of common tragedies. Thomas simply had to be patient and watch for opportunity. It came on a Friday evening in mid-June, when a boy Thomas had seen around town approached the shop just as Thomas was closing up. His name was Samuel, though everyone called him Sam, a scrappy 12-year-old who survived by running errands and doing odd jobs. He was asking after Hollis, hoping to earn a few coins by helping to clean the shop. "Mr. Hollis is at the gem," Thomas said, which was true. "Won't be back for hours. He gets into the cards, sometimes stays all night." Sam's face fell. He had been counting on that money. Thomas could see it in his expression, the desperation that came from needing to eat and having no certainty of the next meal. "I could use help, though," Thomas offered, his voice carefully neutral. "Moving some heavy things in the cold room. I can pay you $1 from the shop funds. Mr. Hollis won't mind." $1 was generous, far more than Sam would earn for simple cleaning work. The older boy hesitated, perhaps sensing something off in the offer, but hunger and poverty made compelling arguments. He nodded acceptance. Thomas led him through the shop toward the cold room, maintaining casual conversation about nothing in particular. The building was quiet, isolated by the noise of Deadwood's nightlife. Inside the cold room, meat hung from hooks in the shadows, the temperature noticeably lower than the summer evening outside. "What needs moving?" Sam asked, looking around at the hanging carcasses. Thomas had already positioned his tools, the same knives he used for his daily work, cleaned and laid out with the care he had learned from Hollis. "I need to show you something first," he said, and his hand moved with the speed of long practice. The details of what followed are unnecessary to recount, but it is worth noting that Thomas approached the task with the same methodical precision he brought to his butchering work. He made observations, tested theories he had developed, and discovered that his studies had prepared him well. The sounds Sam made were similar to those Thomas remembered from his father, though different in pitch and duration. The progression from struggle to stillness followed a pattern Thomas found informative. When it was over, Thomas stood in the cold room surrounded by his work, feeling neither remorse nor satisfaction, only the cool sense of having completed a successful experiment. His clothes were marked, but he had others, and he knew how to clean tools properly. The disposal would follow Hollis's proven methods, adapted slightly for the fact that Thomas needed to work in stages, his strength not yet equal to processing an entire body in one session. Over the next 3 nights, working only when Hollis was certainly absent, Thomas reduced Sam's remains to anonymous components. Some went into the waste pit behind the shop, mixed with animal offal. Some he buried in separate locations around Deadwood, shallow graves unlikely ever to be connected. The few pieces that might be identifiable went into the cold room, hidden among the legitimate inventory where Hollis, even if he stumbled upon them, would likely attribute them to his own nocturnal business and think no more about it. Sam's disappearance caused barely a ripple. A few people asked after him, but in a town where people came and went without warning, where boys ran off to try their luck in other camps, his absence was simply noted and forgotten. Thomas returned to his normal routine, working beside Hollis, learning more with each day, and waiting for the next opportunity. The summer of 1876 unfolded in Deadwood with the characteristic violence and chaos that defined the town's brief history. Wild Bill Hickok's murder in August brought temporary notoriety, drawing even more fortune-seekers and troublemakers to the already overcrowded Gulch. The population swelled past 8,000, straining every resource and turning the streets into rivers of mud and waste whenever the frequent rains came. For Thomas Canfield, now 11 years old, the expanding chaos provided ideal cover. He had developed a careful pattern, selecting subjects with methodical precision. Never children who had families actively looking for them, never those whose disappearance would prompt sustained investigation. Instead, he focused on the truly invisible. Orphans with no connections, children who survived on the margins, those whom Deadwood had already half forgotten while they still lived. His second subject came in late July, a girl of about 9 named Margaret, who slept in the alley behind the Chinese laundry. She had approached the butcher shop begging for scraps, and Thomas had been generous, feeding her several times over the course of a week. He learned her patterns, confirmed she had no one who would miss her, and then one evening invited her to the cold room where he claimed to have stored food specifically for her. This time Thomas was more prepared, more efficient. The process went smoothly, and he discovered that his previous experience had taught him valuable lessons about technique and timing. The disposal followed the proven pattern, and Margaret simply ceased to exist, another ghost in a town already thick with them. But Thomas's activities, careful as they were, could not remain entirely without notice. Garrett Hollis began to observe subtle changes in his young apprentice that accumulated into a vague unease. The boy's competence had grown to the point where he sometimes corrected Hollis's own technique, pointing out more efficient methods of breaking down carcasses. His questions, while ostensibly about butchering, occasionally veered into territory that seemed divorced from the trade. "How long does blood stay liquid after the heart stops?" Thomas asked one day, his tone clinically curious. Hollis paused in his work. "Depends on temperature, I suppose." "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand the processes," Thomas replied, returning his attention to the beef he was sectioning. "So I can work better." There were other small things. Tools moved from where Hollis left them, finding their way into Thomas's preferred arrangements. The cold room showed signs of use during hours when the shop was closed, though nothing was missing and no damage was done. Hollis sometimes caught Thomas staring at customers with an intensity that seemed to look past their surface, as if cataloging something Hollis could not perceive. The butcher told himself he was imagining things, that the boy was simply dedicated to learning the trade. But some nights, drinking whiskey in the Gem Theatre, Hollis found himself wondering about the timing of certain disappearances, children who had been seen near his shop before they vanished. He never quite allowed these thoughts to form into concrete suspicion, always finding reasons to dismiss them. The boy was 11 years old, for God's sake. What Hollis was half imagining was impossible. In September, Thomas selected his third subject, a boy named Joseph who worked intermittently at the stamp mill, operating machinery that crushed ore into powder. Joseph was perhaps 10 years old, though malnutrition made age difficult to estimate, and he had arrived in Deadwood alone, following rumors of work. He had no family, no connections, no one who tracked his movements. Thomas encountered him by chance when Hollis sent the boy to deliver an order to the mill's cook shack. Joseph was nursing a hand injured by the machinery, the fingers crushed badly enough that infection seemed likely. In that moment, Thomas saw not suffering but opportunity. An injured child, possibly dying anyway, whose disappearance could be attributed to any number of causes. Over the next week, Thomas befriended Joseph with calculated generosity, sharing food and expressing concern about the injured hand. When infection did indeed set in, Thomas offered to help, claiming knowledge of medical treatment from his late father. He brought Joseph to the shop after hours, promising to clean and dress the wound properly. Joseph's fate followed the pattern Thomas had established, though this time he paid particular attention to the injured hand, studying how the infection had progressed, how the damaged tissue differed from healthy flesh. The disposal was efficient, perfected through practice, and Joseph joined the others in disappearing completely from Deadwood's record. But something was changing in the town's consciousness. a slow accumulation of unease that had not yet crystallized into active concern. 3 children vanishing over 4 months might have passed without comment in Deadwood's early days, but the community was beginning to stabilize, to develop a memory and a conscience. Constance Pritchard, who kept the informal orphan records, noted the disappearances in her ledger and felt a growing disquiet she could not quite justify. She mentioned it one afternoon to Hollis when he came to deliver meat to the association building. 3 children gone since summer, she said, her tone troubled. Sam Ridley, Margaret Chen, Joseph Tibbs, all within 4 months. Hollis shifted uncomfortably. Children leave Deadwood all the time. Head to other camps, get taken in by travelers. It's the nature of this place. Perhaps, Constance replied, but her expression suggested she found the explanation inadequate. Still, it troubles me. They were all so young, so vulnerable. That evening, Hollis watched Thomas work with unusual attention, looking for he knew not what. The boy was preparing a pig for the next day's sales, his movements practiced and efficient. There was nothing overtly wrong, nothing that justified suspicion, yet Hollis found himself unable to shake a creeping sense of wrongness. "Thomas," he said slowly, "you remember that boy Sam? Used to run errands around town." Thomas looked up, his pale eyes meeting Hollis's with perfect neutrality. "I remember him. He came by the shop once looking for work." "Just once?" "Just once," Thomas confirmed. "You were at the gem and I told him to come back when you were here. I never saw him again." The answer was delivered with such calm certainty that Hollis felt foolish for his suspicions. Yet that night, he found himself checking the cold room with unusual thoroughness, looking for he knew not what among the hanging meat. He found nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything beyond the normal operations of a butcher shop, though his eyes passed over certain pieces without recognition, his mind refusing to examine them too closely. In October, as Deadwood's population began to contract with the approach of winter, Thomas exercised unusual restraint. He recognized that the pattern of disappearances had drawn some attention, however vague. Better to pause, to allow the town's short memory to fade, to wait for the right circumstances. His patience was not motivated by fear of capture, but by a desire to continue his studies undisturbed for as long as possible. He turned 12 in November, though the date passed without celebration or acknowledgement. Hollis had come to rely on him substantially, and the butcher shop ran more efficiently than ever. Thomas had become a fixture of Deadwood's commercial life, that quiet boy who worked at Hollis's place, unremarkable except for his skill with knives and his curious stillness. Winter came hard that year, snow piling in the gulch and ice making the streets treacherous. The population contracted further as fair-weather prospectors fled to warmer territories. In the cold and isolation, Deadwood's character intensified, becoming more insular, more willing to overlook the darkness in its midst for the sake of survival. Thomas waited through the worst of winter, continuing his work, refining his understanding. He had learned patience from his father's death, the value of careful planning and execution. When the thaw came in early March of 1877, he would be ready to resume his studies more skilled and more cautious than before. But the world beyond Deadwood was beginning to take notice of the lawless town in the Black Hills. Territorial authorities, pressed by concerns about federal intervention and the need to establish legitimate governance, were making plans. Among these was a decision to assign a company of Pinkerton agents to investigate various criminal enterprises in Deadwood, from claim-jumping to murder. The agent who would eventually arrive, a man named Robert Becker, was already compiling reports from territorial records, noting patterns and anomalies. Among the data he reviewed were population statistics, mortality records, and among these, a small notation about missing children that caught his attention, not for any single case, but for a pattern he recognized from other investigations. Thomas, working in the butcher shop as winter released its grip on Deadwood, had no knowledge of these distant developments. He simply continued his routine, waiting for spring and the opportunities it would bring, unaware that the isolation that had protected him was beginning to crack. Spring arrived in Deadwood with the usual chaos of thawing mud and renewed gold fever. The population surged again as prospectors returned from winter camps. and the town's criminal element emerged from hibernation with renewed vigor. For Thomas Canfield, now 12 and working with the proficiency of a journeyman butcher, the warming weather meant the return of the transient population that provided his preferred subjects. In April of 1877, he identified his fourth opportunity. A boy called Daniel, perhaps 9 years old, who had arrived with a group of prospectors from Wyoming. The men had brought him along as camp help, but within 2 weeks they abandoned him, heading into the hills without bothering to ensure the child had any means of survival. Daniel survived by scavenging and begging, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. Thomas observed him for 10 days, confirming the pattern of isolation and invisibility he required. When he finally approached Daniel with an offer of regular meals in exchange for light work at the butcher shop, the hungry boy accepted immediately, desperate for any stability. But Thomas had grown more sophisticated in his method. Rather than rushing to the conclusion, he kept Daniel working legitimately for nearly 2 weeks, establishing a visible pattern of employment. Hollis, who by this point trusted Thomas's judgment completely, barely noticed the addition of another occasional helper. The boy swept floors, hauled water, ran small errands, becoming a familiar sight around the shop. This patience served Thomas well. When Daniel did disappear, taken to the cold room late one evening, when Hollis was deeply involved in a poker game at the Gem, the pattern of employment provided an alternative explanation. The boy had been working, had earned some money, must have decided to move on to another camp. It was the natural rhythm of deadwood life. Thomas's technique had evolved with practice. He worked with increased efficiency, his understanding of anatomy now deeply refined. The disposal followed the perfected pattern, though he introduced a new element, scattering remains across a wider geographic area, using his knowledge of Deadwood's layout and the surrounding wilderness to ensure no concentration of evidence. What Thomas did not know was that Robert Becker had arrived in Deadwood 3 days before Daniel's disappearance. Becker was not what one might expect of a Pinkerton agent. At 42, he was slight of build, with a scholar's stoop and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a clerk rather than an investigator. This appearance was precisely what made him effective. People overlooked him, spoke freely in his presence, assumed he was harmless. But behind those spectacles were eyes trained in observation, and his mind worked with methodical precision. He had come to Deadwood ostensibly to investigate gold theft from the Homestake mine, a legitimate concern that provided cover for his broader mission, evaluating the criminal infrastructure of the town with an eye toward federal intervention. The territorial governor, under pressure from Washington to bring order to the Black Hills, wanted a comprehensive report on Deadwood's underworld. Becker established himself at a boarding house on Lower Main Street and began the patient work of observation. He visited saloons, gambling halls, and legitimate businesses, always watching, always listening, building a mental map of Deadwood's power structures and criminal networks. In this process, he encountered Garrett Hollis's name in connection with whispered rumors about disposal services for certain of the town's more problematic deaths. Intrigued, Becker began watching the butcher shop with particular interest. He noted the comings and goings, the deliveries and customers, the rhythms of the business. And he took note of the boy who worked there, the thin 12-year-old with unsettling pale eyes who moved with unusual precision and purpose. It was a week after Daniel's disappearance that Becker first spoke with Constance Pritchard. He presented himself as a territorial census agent, interested in population movements and demographics. Constance, eager to discuss her concerns with someone who might have authority to address them, spoke freely about the orphan population and her growing unease about the disappearances. 5 children in 11 months, she said, consulting her ledger. Sam Ridley, Margaret Chen, Joseph Tibbs, Daniel Wright. And now I hear that the Fletcher girl hasn't been seen in 3 days. In the early days, such things were common. But we've developed enough stability that it troubles me. Becker listened with careful attention, his mind already working on the pattern. All orphans, all without families. Yes, Constance confirmed. The ones no one truly watches, no one claims. It's as if someone knows precisely which children will be missed least, or someone who encounters children regularly, who would know their circumstances. Becker mused, more to himself than to her. Over the next 2 weeks, Becker investigated the 5 disappearances Constance had identified. He interviewed people who had known the children, traced their last known movements, and assembled a timeline. What emerged was suggestive rather than conclusive. But 3 of the 5 children had last been seen near or asking after the butcher shop on Main Street. Becker began watching the shop more closely. He observed Hollis, whose activities suggested involvement in Deadwood's criminal disposal network, but nothing that pointed to the children. But the boy, Thomas, drew Becker's increasing attention. There was something in the way he moved, the way he observed others, a quality of watching that Becker recognized from his years of investigation. The boy was studying people, cataloging them, and that suggested a mind far more calculating than his age would suggest. One afternoon, Becker entered the shop as a customer, purchasing a modest amount of beef. Hollis served him with professional efficiency, but Becker's attention was on Thomas, who was cleaning knives at a side table. The boy's technique was remarkable, his movements suggesting deep familiarity with the tools. "Your apprentice is quite skilled," Becker observed casually. Hollis glanced at Thomas with something like pride. "Best hand with a knife I've seen in a boy his age. Natural talent for the work." "How long has he been with you?" Becker asked, maintaining his casual tone. "Coming up on a year now," Hollis replied. "Orphaned boy, father died in a mine collapse. Needed work, and I needed help. Worked out well for both of us." Becker nodded, made small talk about the quality of the meat, and departed. But his mind was working rapidly, calculating timelines. The boy had arrived in late March 1876. The first disappearance had been in June. It was suggestive, though far from conclusive. Over the following days, Becker investigated Thomas Canfield's background more thoroughly. What he discovered was disturbing in its vagueness. The mine collapse that supposedly killed Jonathan Canfield had indeed occurred, but there were anomalies in the accounts. The freight hauler who brought Thomas to Deadwood, Silas Vaughan, when located and questioned, remembered finding the boy alone, but noted that he had seemed remarkably composed for a child who had just lost his father. No body had ever been recovered from the collapse, which was attributed to the instability of the shaft. Becker examined the collapsed mine personally, riding out to the site with a mining engineer he had befriended. What they found suggested that the collapse had not been entirely natural. Certain support timbers showed signs of deliberate weakening, cut marks that had been disguised but remained visible to expert examination. "Someone wanted this shaft to come down," the engineer said, studying the evidence. "Whether to cover up poor construction or for some other reason I couldn't say, but this was no accident." Becker rode back to Deadwood with a growing theory taking shape in his mind. A boy who had possibly murdered his own father, who had then positioned himself in a trade that provided both the tools and the knowledge for efficient disposal of bodies, who worked in an establishment already known for making inconvenient corpses disappear. It was a theory that strained credibility, that seemed to attribute to a 12-year-old child a level of calculation and cold-bloodedness that Becker had rarely encountered in adult criminals. Yet the evidence, circumstantial as it was, continued to accumulate. Becker began interviewing people who had interacted with Thomas, carefully avoiding questions that might alert the boy to the investigation. What emerged was a portrait of a child who inspired unease in those perceptive enough to notice. A storekeeper mentioned that Thomas had once asked detailed questions about poisons used for rat control, specifically about dosages and symptoms. A doctor recalled treating a minor cut on the boy's hand and being struck by Thomas's complete lack of reaction to pain, as if he were observing his own injury from a distance. "Strangest child I've encountered," the doctor told Becker. "Polite, intelligent, but there was something missing, like looking at a very convincing imitation of a boy, rather than an actual child." Meanwhile, Thomas had become aware of Becker's presence in Deadwood, though not yet of his specific interest. The Pinkerton agent was too skilled to be obvious in his surveillance, but Thomas possessed an almost preternatural awareness of being observed. He noted Becker's visits to the shop, the casual questions, the way the man's eyes lingered on him with a quality different from ordinary curiosity. Thomas did not panic. Instead, he did what he had always done. He observed, he calculated, and he adapted. He recognized that Becker represented a potential threat, but also that the agent had no concrete evidence, only suspicions. The solution was to provide alternative explanations, to muddy the waters, and most importantly, to cease his activities until the threat passed. For 6 weeks, through May and into June of 1877, Thomas became a model of unremarkable behavior. He worked diligently at the butcher shop, interacted normally with customers, and made no attempts to select new subjects. He was patient, understanding that Becker's investigation would eventually reach a dead end without fresh evidence. But Becker was equally patient, and he was looking in a direction Thomas had not anticipated. Rather than focusing solely on proving Thomas's guilt, Becker began investigating the butcher shop's nocturnal activities more broadly. He stationed himself in a boarding house across from the shop, watching through the nights, noting the occasional late visitors, the wrapped bundles that changed hands in darkness. On a moonless night in mid-June, Becker observed one such transaction. 2 men arrived with a canvas-wrapped burden of unmistakable human proportions. Money changed hands with Garrett Hollis, and the bundle was taken to the cold room. Becker documented the incident meticulously, including descriptions of the men involved, whom he recognized as enforcers for one of Deadwood's gambling operations. The next morning, Becker obtained a warrant from Deadwood's newly appointed territorial magistrate, a federal appointee named Harrison Engel, who had arrived with a mandate to establish legitimate law. The warrant authorized search of Hollis's butcher shop and cold room based on suspicion of disposing of murdered bodies. When Becker arrived with Engel and 3 deputized men, Hollis was genuinely surprised. His nocturnal disposal business had operated for so long without interference that he had grown careless. Thomas, however, recognized immediately the significance of the warrant and the specific focus on the cold room. The search revealed exactly what Becker expected. Partial human remains, recently delivered, not yet fully processed. Hollis, faced with undeniable evidence, confessed immediately to the disposal business, attempting to minimize his role as merely providing a service, claiming ignorance of the specific murders. It was a pragmatic confession, designed to result in charges for accessory after the fact rather than murder itself. But as the deputies began documenting the evidence, one of them, a man with experience in such grim work, noticed anomalies. Among the recent remains were older fragments, preserved in the cold, their state of processing suggesting different time frames, different techniques, and more disturbing. Some of these showed marks inconsistent with the quick, brutal murders typical of Deadwood's criminal element. These were careful, methodical, almost surgical in their precision. "Mr. Becker," the deputy called, his voice tight, "you should see this." What they had discovered were remnants of Thomas's earlier work, pieces he had hidden among Hollis's legitimate inventory and illegal disposal jobs, assuming they would never be distinguished from the rest. But to trained eyes, the difference in technique was apparent. Hollis's processing of criminal disposal jobs was efficient but rough, focused on rapid reduction. These older pieces showed a different hand, one that worked with careful precision, that took time to explore and understand anatomy. Becker examined the evidence with growing certainty. "Mr. Hollis," he said slowly, "how long have you been conducting your disposal business?" Hollis, sweating now, calculated rapidly. 3 years, perhaps 4, since Deadwood's early days. "And this work?" Becker indicated the more carefully processed remains. "This is different from your usual method." Hollis leaned closer, studying the evidence, and his face drained of color as understanding dawned. The technique was familiar because he had taught it. The precision, the careful separation of muscle and bone, the methodical exploration of anatomy. This was butchering technique applied with a skill level he recognized. "Thomas," Hollis whispered, the name escaping him before he could consider the implications. Becker turned to where Thomas stood near the shop's entrance, watching the proceedings with that characteristic stillness. The boy's face showed no emotion, no fear or guilt, only a kind of calm assessment of the situation. "Thomas Canfield," Becker said formally, "I have questions regarding your activities in this establishment and your possible connection to the disappearances of several children from Deadwood." For a long moment, Thomas simply looked at Becker, those pale grey eyes revealing nothing. Then, in a voice utterly devoid of inflection, he said, "I want to speak with you. Alone." Magistrate Engel set up a temporary examination room in the Deadwood Merchants Association building, the closest thing the town had to an official government facility. Thomas was held there under guard, while Becker completed his initial investigation of the butcher shop. The search ultimately revealed fragments that, when carefully examined, suggested at least 4 different individuals beyond the recent criminal disposal case. Constance Pritchard, upon hearing of the arrest, brought her ledgers to Engel, her hands trembling as she laid out the documented disappearances. 5 children, she said, her voice breaking. I kept telling myself they had simply moved on, found better circumstances, but I knew. Somehow, I knew. Becker spent hours at the butcher shop, working with the deputies to document every piece of evidence. What emerged was a picture of meticulous planning and execution that seemed impossible to attribute to a 12-year-old child. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The technique matched Thomas's demonstrated skills. The timeline aligned with his presence in Deadwood. And most damningly, some of the remains showed characteristics consistent with the missing children's descriptions. When Becker finally sat down across from Thomas in the examination room, the boy had been waiting for 6 hours without food or water. He showed no signs of distress, sitting with perfect stillness, his hands folded on the rough wooden table between them. The room was sparse: 2 chairs, the table, a single lamp casting harsh shadows. "You said you wanted to speak with me," Becker began, setting his notebook on the table. "I'm listening." Thomas studied the investigator with those unsettling pale eyes. "You're different from the others here," he said finally. "You see patterns. You understand method." "I understand evidence," Becker replied carefully. "And the evidence suggests you've done terrible things." "Define terrible," Thomas said, and his tone was genuinely curious, not challenging. "I've observed that people use that word differently depending on context. Mr. Hollis disposed of murdered bodies, yet you seem to consider him less terrible than me. Why?" Becker felt a chill at the clinical nature of the question. "Hollis facilitated crimes, but you, if the evidence is correct, you killed children. There's a profound difference." "Is there?" Thomas tilted his head slightly. "The people Hollis helped dispose of were alive once. Someone killed them. Hollis profited from their deaths. I simply wanted to understand how things worked, how bodies functioned, how they stopped functioning. Where's the difference in intent?" "The difference is that you did the killing yourself," Becker said, keeping his voice level despite the growing horror of the conversation. "You chose victims, planned their deaths, and carried them out." Thomas nodded slowly, as if Becker had made an interesting point in a philosophical discussion. "I can see how that distinction matters to people. It never mattered to me. Death is death. Whether I cause it or simply observe its aftermath seemed irrelevant to the learning." Becker leaned forward slightly. "Thomas, I need you to understand the gravity of what you're saying. Are you confessing to killing those children?" "I'm explaining my perspective," Thomas replied. "Whether you call it confession is your interpretation. I did what was necessary to understand. The children I chose were going to suffer anyway. Deadwood kills children constantly through neglect, disease, accident. I simply made their deaths useful." The casual monstrousness of this statement struck Becker like a physical blow. He had interviewed killers before, men who murdered for profit or passion or madness. But this child spoke of death with the detached interest of a scientist discussing specimens. There was no evil in his tone, no pleasure or regret, only a vast emptiness where emotion should reside. "Useful how?" Becker asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I learned anatomy," Thomas explained patiently. "Mr. Hollis taught me about animal bodies, but I knew the real understanding required human subjects. I learned which cuts were most efficient, how different tissues responded to different tools, how long various processes took. Each subject taught me something new." Becker's hand moved across his notebook mechanically, recording the words that would damn this child before any court. "And your father, Jonathan Canfield, was he also a subject for your learning?" Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, the first hint of emotion Becker had seen. "My father was necessary," the boy said, his voice dropping slightly. "He hurt me regularly, and I studied each injury. Eventually I understood that he was teaching me through his violence. When I had learned enough, I applied that learning to ensure he couldn't hurt me anymore. The mind collapse was merely the method. The real lesson was in planning, in patience, in executing a plan without error. "You were 10 years old," Becker said, and despite himself, there was something like pity in his voice. "Age is irrelevant to understanding," Thomas replied. "I've always seen things clearly. Other people seem to experience the world through layers of emotion that distort their perception. I see what is actually there. It's not a choice. It's simply how I am." Becker sat back, studying the boy before him. In his years with the Pinkerton Agency, he had developed a sense for when criminals were performing, creating personas to manipulate their interrogators. But Thomas displayed none of that artifice. He was simply terribly being exactly what he was. A human being born without the capacity for empathy, who had learned to navigate the world through pure observation and logic, and who had found in Deadwood's chaos the perfect environment to pursue his curiosity about death. "The evidence we've found," Becker said carefully, "suggests 4 victims beyond your father. Can you confirm that number?" Thomas considered the question. "The evidence you found depends on what survived my disposal process and what you recognized as significant. Your forensic methods are limited. I may have been more thorough than you realize, or less thorough. The number matters to you because you're trying to quantify culpability. It doesn't matter to me because each subject was valuable for what I learned, regardless of total count." It was as close to a confession as Thomas would provide, Becker realized. The boy was too intelligent to explicitly enumerate his crimes, but his willingness to discuss methodology and motivation served the same purpose. Any jury hearing this conversation would convict without hesitation. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, and again his tone was merely curious. "You'll be charged with murder," Becker replied. "Given the evidence and your own statements, conviction is certain. The question will be sentencing." "Will they hang me?" Thomas asked, showing the same clinical interest he might give to any question about process. Becker felt suddenly exhausted, weighed down by the enormity of what he had uncovered. "Possibly, though your age may result in a different sentence. Life imprisonment, perhaps in an institution." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose I should feel fear at that prospect, but I find I'm simply curious about what such an experience would be like. Another form of study in a way." Before Becker could respond, a commotion erupted outside the examination room. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and then the door burst open to reveal Garrett Hollis, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, a revolver in his hand. The guards had apparently been overpowered or deceived. "You monster!" Hollis snarled at Thomas, his voice thick with whiskey and horror. "I taught you a trade, gave you a place, and you used it for this? You made me part of your evil." Thomas looked at the butcher with mild interest, showing no fear of the weapon pointed at him. "You were already part of evil, Mr. Hollis. You disposed of murdered bodies for money. The only difference is that some of those bodies were mine. Does that really change the moral calculation?" The logic of it, the cold rationality, seemed to enrage Hollis further. His hand shook as he raised the revolver, and Becker moved instinctively, knowing he could never reach the man in time to prevent the shot. But the sound that came was not a gunshot. Instead, Hollis's face contorted with sudden pain, and he collapsed, the revolver clattering to the floor. Behind him stood one of the deputies, who had struck Hollis with the butt of a rifle. In the chaos that followed, as men rushed to secure Hollis and restore order, Thomas remained perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with that characteristic detachment. When his eyes met Becker's across the confused crowd, the investigator saw something that chilled him more than anything else in this terrible case. Disappointment. Thomas had been curious to see what death by shooting would be like, and the interruption had denied him even that final observation. The trial of Thomas Canfield began on July 23, 1877, in a hastily assembled courtroom on the second floor of the Grand Central Hotel. Deadwood had no proper courthouse, but Magistrate Engel was determined that this case would be handled with as much legal propriety as the frontier could muster. The territorial governor, recognizing the significance of the case, had sent a prosecutor from Yankton, a severe man named Marcus Whitlock, who specialized in capital crimes. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators crammed into every available space and more crowding the hallway outside. The case had captured the morbid fascination of the entire territory. A child murderer was sensational enough, but one who had killed other children with cold calculation, who showed no remorse and discussed his crimes as if they were scientific experiments, that was unprecedented. Thomas sat at the defense table beside his appointed attorney, a young lawyer named David Fletcher, who had drawn the assignment by default, being the only member of the territorial bar willing to take the case. Fletcher had spent the previous weeks in a state of growing despair, realizing that his client had no interest in mounting a defense and seemed to view the trial as merely another interesting experience to observe. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Becker took the stand and laid out the evidence piece by piece. The timeline of disappearances, the remains found in the butcher shop, the forensic analysis that linked those remains to the missing children, and most damningly, Thomas's own statements during the interrogation. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as Becker recounted the boy's clinical discussion of his crimes, his complete lack of emotional response, his treatment of murdered children as subjects for anatomical study. Constance Pritchard testified through tears, describing each missing child, their circumstances, their vulnerability. "They were the forgotten ones," she said, her voice breaking. "The children no one claimed, no one protected, and he knew it. He selected them because no one would raise the alarm." The forensic evidence was presented with meticulous detail. A doctor from Denver, brought in specifically for his expertise in post-mortem examination, testified that the remains showed characteristics consistent with the missing children's known features. More disturbing was his analysis of the manner of death, which suggested careful study rather than quick killing. "These children were not simply murdered," he testified. "They were dissected, examined. The cuts show knowledge of anatomy, precision that increased with each victim. This was someone learning, practicing, perfecting technique." Garrett Hollis, facing his own charges as an accessory, testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony focused on Thomas's unusual interest in anatomical detail, the questions that had seemed odd at the time, but now revealed sinister purpose. "He was always watching, always studying," Hollis said, his voice hollow. "I thought he was just dedicated to learning the trade. I never imagined." The defense Fletcher mounted was necessarily limited. He could not dispute the evidence, could not claim innocence. Instead, he argued for mitigation based on Thomas's age and what he termed a profound mental deficiency that prevented the defendant from understanding the moral weight of his actions. "This is not a case of evil," Fletcher argued in his closing statement, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a case of a child born without the capacity for normal human emotion, who acted on curiosity without the moral framework that guides us all. He is more to be pitied than condemned." But it was Thomas himself who undermined even this limited defense. Against Fletcher's desperate advice, the boy insisted on testifying, and Magistrate Engel, sensing that justice required the defendant be heard, allowed it. Thomas took the stand with the same calm he had shown throughout the proceedings. Whitlock's cross-examination was brief, almost gentle, recognizing that the defendant would condemn himself more effectively than any prosecutorial attack. "Thomas," Whitlock began, "do you understand that the children you killed experienced fear and pain?" "I understand that they exhibited physical responses consistent with those states," Thomas replied in his flat, precise voice. "Whether their subjective experience matched what others call fear and pain, I cannot say with certainty. I can only observe external manifestations." "Did their suffering matter to you?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Matter suggests an emotional weighting that I don't experience. Their responses were informative. Beyond that, the question of mattering doesn't apply to how I process information. Do you feel any remorse for what you've done? Remorse for..." "I understand that remorse is an emotional response to perceived wrongdoing," Thomas said. "I don't experience such responses. I can recognize that my actions violated social and legal norms. But that recognition is intellectual. not emotional. If you're asking whether I wish I hadn't done it, the answer is no. The knowledge I gained was valuable to me. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Engel gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Thomas had confirmed in his own words the portrait of a being fundamentally alien to human moral feeling. Fletcher attempted damage control in redirect, trying to frame Thomas's statements as evidence of mental incompetence. But Thomas would not cooperate even with his own defense. "I'm not incompetent," he said, interrupting Fletcher's questioning. "I understand perfectly well what I did and why it violates your moral codes. I simply don't share those codes. That's not incompetence. It's difference. An unfortunate difference, perhaps, given the consequences, but difference nonetheless." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts, guilty of 5 murders in the first degree. The swiftness of the decision surprised no one, but the question of sentencing posed unprecedented challenges. Engel adjourned for 3 days to research precedents and consider the sentence. In the territorial law of Dakota, murder in the first degree carried a mandatory death sentence. But the defendant was 12 years old, and no child had been executed in the territory's history. The question became not just one of justice, but of precedent and territorial identity. During those 3 days, Deadwood engaged in intense debate. Some argued that Thomas's age demanded mercy, that execution of a child would stain the territory's emerging claim to civilization. Others contended that the calculated nature of his crimes, his complete lack of remorse, and the danger he would always pose meant that age should not matter. Becker, watching the debates unfold, found himself in an unusual position of ambivalence. His investigation had proven Thomas's guilt beyond question, but the investigator found no satisfaction in the prospect of a child's execution. Yet he recognized that Thomas represented a unique danger, a being without conscience who had already demonstrated willingness and ability to kill. Imprisonment, even for life, seemed inadequate given Thomas's intelligence and calculating nature. On the 3rd day, Engel reconvened the court to deliver his sentence. The courtroom was even more packed than before, with people waiting outside in the street to hear the decision. "Thomas Canfield," Engel began, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "you have been found guilty of 5 counts of murder in the first degree. The evidence presented was overwhelming, and your own testimony confirmed the calculated, deliberate nature of your crimes. In my years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that more clearly demonstrated premeditation and a complete absence of moral feeling." He paused, looking down at Thomas, who returned his gaze with that unsettling calm. "The question before this court is how to sentence a child who has committed acts of such profound evil, who shows no capacity for remorse or rehabilitation. The law provides for death in such cases, but the application of that sentence to one so young troubles the conscience of this court and, I believe, of this community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fletcher leaned forward, hoping for mercy despite knowing his client would likely be indifferent to it. "However," Engel continued, his voice hardening, "this court must also consider the safety of the community and the likelihood of future harm. The defendant has demonstrated not only the willingness, but the capability to kill with cold efficiency. His testimony revealed no possibility of moral development, no capacity for the emotional growth that might lead to remorse or change. He is, by his own account, fundamentally incapable of valuing human life." Engel's next words fell like hammer blows. "Therefore, while mindful of the defendant's age, this court finds that the interests of justice and public safety require the ultimate penalty. Thomas Canfield, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, said sentence to be carried out on August 15, 1877 at noon, in accordance with territorial law." The courtroom exploded in reaction, some crying out in approval, others in protest. Fletcher slumped in his chair, having failed in the most basic duty of a defense attorney. And Thomas, the focus of all this fury and anguish, simply nodded slightly, as if Engel had confirmed an interesting hypothesis. As guards moved to escort Thomas back to the makeshift jail, he turned to look at Becker, who sat in the front row. Their eyes met across the chaos of the courtroom, and Thomas spoke, his voice somehow carrying through the din. "Thank you for seeing clearly. Most people can't." Becker would remember those words for the rest of his life, though he never quite understood whether they were meant as gratitude, acknowledgement, or something else entirely from a mind that processed the world in ways fundamentally alien to human understanding. The 2 weeks between sentencing and execution saw Deadwood transform into a battleground of moral debate. Petitions circulated arguing for clemency, signed by those who believed executing a child was barbaric regardless of his crimes. Counter-petitions demanded the sentence be carried out, citing the calculated nature of Thomas's murders and the need to demonstrate that justice applied equally regardless of age. The territorial governor received hundreds of letters, but ultimately declined to intervene, stating that Magistrate Engel's decision fell within proper legal bounds. Thomas himself remained eerily calm throughout this period. Confined to a cell in the town's reinforced jail, he spent his days reading books brought by Fletcher, who continued his representation despite the conviction. The boy showed particular interest in medical texts and anatomy books, which the lawyer reluctantly provided after determining there was no harm in it, given the impending execution. "Don't you fear death?" Fletcher asked during one visit, genuinely trying to understand this child who had become his burden. Thomas looked up from a volume on human physiology. "Fear requires emotional investment in continued existence. I find existence interesting, but I don't cling to it emotionally. I'm curious about what death will be like, though I recognize I won't be able to process the experience afterward. It's a logical paradox that intrigues me." Fletcher left these visits feeling hollow, disturbed by conversations with someone who discussed his own impending death with the detachment of a scholar contemplating an abstract problem. Becker visited Thomas once, 3 days before the scheduled execution. He had told himself he wouldn't, that there was nothing to be gained from further interaction with the boy. But something drew him to the jail, a need he couldn't quite articulate to understand this case that had consumed him. Thomas seemed unsurprised to see him. "Agent Becker," he said with something approximating politeness, "I wondered if you would come. I needed to ask you something," Becker said, settling into the chair across from the cell bars. "Your father, you said his violence taught you. But children who suffer abuse typically become either victims who flee violence or perpetrators who recreate it emotionally. You became something else. Why?" Thomas considered the question carefully, as he did all questions. "My father's violence was informative, but not formative in the way you mean. I didn't become cruel because of cruelty. I was always this way. His violence simply provided data. I learned what hurt, how different injuries affected function, how pain influenced behavior. When I ended his life, it wasn't revenge. It was the logical conclusion of his usefulness as a subject. And the children in Deadwood? They were just more subjects?" "Yes," Thomas replied simply, "though each taught me different things. The first was experimental, testing whether I could apply Mr. Hollis's methods to human anatomy. Subsequent subjects allowed me to refine technique, to understand variation, to develop efficiency. If I had more time, I would have continued learning." Becker felt the familiar chill of conversing with this boy, who spoke of murdered children as research data. "Does any part of you recognize the horror of what you've done?" "I recognize that others are horrified," Thomas said. "I understand intellectually why society condemns these actions. But recognition and feeling are different things. You might as well ask if I recognize the color red while being colorblind. I can understand the concept without experiencing the perception." "What do you think will happen after you die?" Becker asked, surprising himself with the question. Thomas tilted his head thoughtfully. "I suspect nothing. Consciousness seems to be a function of brain activity, and death ends that. Though I admit the possibility of being wrong intrigues me. If some form of consciousness persists, it would suggest I misunderstood fundamental aspects of existence. Either way, I'll have an answer soon." Becker left the jail feeling a profound sadness that had nothing to do with pity for Thomas and everything to do with the randomness of human nature. that a being could be born so fundamentally disconnected from the emotional architecture that made humans social creatures. Thomas wasn't evil in any traditional sense. He was simply absent of the capacity for moral feeling, a biological accident that had resulted in death for 5 children and would result in death for the child himself. August 15, 1877, dawned clear and hot over Deadwood. A scaffold had been erected in the open space near the town's center, built with grim efficiency by carpenters who worked in silence, uncomfortable with their task. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered, hundreds of people drawn by morbid curiosity, moral outrage, or simple desire to witness a historic moment. The first legal execution in Deadwood's history would also be the execution of a child, a fact that sat uneasily even with those who believed justice demanded it. Thomas was led from the jail at 11:30, his hands bound but his demeanor unchanged. He wore clean clothes provided by the court, and his dark hair had been neatly trimmed. He looked even younger than his 12 years, small and thin against the bulk of the guards who escorted him. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some called out in anger, demanding justice for the murdered children. Others wept, overcome by the sight of a child walking to his execution. Most simply watched in silence, struggling with the collision of justice and mercy, law and compassion. Magistrate Engel stood near the scaffold, his face drawn. Beside him was a minister who had visited Thomas repeatedly, trying to provide spiritual comfort and receiving only polite indifference in return. The hangman was a professional brought from Cheyenne specifically for this task, a man experienced enough to ensure a quick death. Thomas climbed the scaffold steps without hesitation, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with clinical interest. When offered a chance to speak final words, he surprised everyone by accepting. His voice, though young, carried clearly in the hushed stillness. "I understand why you're doing this," he said, his tone conversational. "Society requires shared moral codes to function, and I violated those codes. My inability to feel as you feel doesn't exempt me from consequences. That's logical." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I'm curious whether any of you have wondered if there are others like me, people born without your emotional framework, who have simply learned to hide it better than I did. It's statistically probable given population size. Something to think about." The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd like a dark wave. The idea that other children, other people, might be moving among them with Thomas's same empty core, simply better at mimicking normal human feeling, was deeply disturbing. As the noose was placed around his neck, Thomas showed his first visible sign of emotion, though whether it was fear or simply intense curiosity was impossible to determine. His breathing quickened slightly, and his eyes widened, taking in every detail of his final moments with the same focused attention he had brought to everything. The hangman checked the knot, the minister said a final prayer that Thomas ignored, and Engel gave the signal. The trap dropped, and Thomas Canfield's brief, terrible life ended with the sharp crack of a breaking neck. The crowd stood in stunned silence for a long moment before slowly dispersing, each person left to wrestle with their own feelings about what justice had required and what civilization had lost. In the days that followed, Deadwood tried to return to normal, but the case left a lasting mark. Constance Pritchard intensified her efforts to protect orphaned children, establishing formal systems to track their welfare. The butcher shop was sold to new owners who completely renovated it, as if fresh paint and new fixtures could erase the horrors that had occurred there. Garrett Hollis served 3 years for his disposal activities and left the territory upon release, never to return. Robert Becker completed his investigation of Deadwood's criminal infrastructure and submitted his report to the territorial governor. But he never forgot the Thomas Canfield case, and it influenced his approach to investigation for the rest of his career. He became known for his attention to the psychology of criminals, his understanding that evil sometimes wore unexpected faces. The case file was sealed by territorial order in 1882, deemed too disturbing for public consumption. It remained locked away until 1952, when renovation of an old government building uncovered the documents. By then, the players were all long dead. Deadwood had transformed from lawless mining camp to small legitimate town, and the case existed only as a dark footnote in frontier history. But the questions Thomas raised in his final statement lingered. In the decades that followed, as psychology and psychiatry advanced, medical professionals began to understand conditions like psychopathy, the absence of empathy and emotional connection that Thomas had displayed. His case, when it was finally studied, became a reference point for understanding that such conditions could manifest even in children, that evil wasn't always created by circumstance, but could be present from the beginning. The 5 children Thomas murdered, Sam Ridley, Margaret Chen, Joseph Tibbs, Daniel Wright, and Emily Fletcher, were eventually memorialized with a small marker in Mount Moriah Cemetery, their names preserved even though their bodies had been lost to Thomas's methodical disposal. Constance Pritchard, before her death in 1903, established a fund to maintain the marker, ensuring these forgotten children would be remembered. As for Thomas Canfield himself, he was buried in an unmarked grave outside the cemetery proper, in ground designated for criminals and the unnamed dead. No marker was placed, and within a generation even the location of his grave was forgotten. Deadwood wanted to forget, to erase this dark chapter from its history. But the story persisted in whispers and half-remembered tales, the account of the boy who killed with cold precision, who felt nothing, who represented a kind of human monster more terrifying than any supernatural horror because he was utterly, completely real. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Does Thomas's suggestion about others like him hiding in plain sight disturb you as much as it disturbed those who heard it in 1877? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this historical mystery as chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of American history. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime and historical mysteries, and let us know what case you'd like us to investigate next. Until then, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that look most human.